Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Desiderio from Punchbowl News, the Honorable Chrissy Houlahan from the state of Pennsylvania, and the Honorable Mike Waltz from Florida.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Andrew Desiderio. I'm senior congressional reporter at Punchbowl News. We are thrilled to be back here once again as a media sponsor at the annual Concordia Summit. If you are new to Punchbowl News, we are a 3.5-year-old media startup based in Washington, D.C., where we cover power, people, and politics in our nation's capital. I'm thrilled to be here with such a great panel. I've got to my immediate right here, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan, Democrat from my native Pennsylvania. She's an Air Force veteran, and she serves on the House Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. And to her right, I have Congressman Michael Waltz, a Republican from Florida. He is the first Green Beret ever elected to Congress, and he serves on the Armed Services, Intelligence, and Foreign Affairs Committees. Quite the roster there for both of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to be here. Again, Punchbowl News is thrilled to be a sponsor once again at this year's summit. We're here today at the start of the UN General Assembly at what is obviously a very fraught time in the world. We have conflicts raging in Ukraine, in Gaza, of course, as well. And also top of mind, of course, is the pacing threat of China. And I want to get into all of that with my panel here. In addition to the fact that in 10 weeks or so, we have a little thing called a presidential election coming up, which is providing for quite a bit of uncertainty about what U.S. foreign policy will look like for the next 4 years. And of course, Congress has a very important role to play in all of this, regardless of who wins the presidential race. Congressman Waltz, I want to start with you. Right now, there's this debate over whether to lift existing restrictions on Ukraine's ability to strike inside Russian territory. Bipartisan majorities in Congress have written letters to the Biden administration saying that they need to lift the rest of these restrictions. The Ukrainians are here in New York, and then they're going to be in Washington later this week making the same case. On the other hand, former President Trump has been saying that he's going to end the war on day one. He has said that he wants to negotiate a peace settlement of some sort. Mm-hmm. Are those two goals in conflict with each other?
Well, first, good to be on with you and good to be on with my friend and colleague, Chrissy Houlahan. We both came into Congress together, and we're both, as fellow veterans, members of a bipartisan, veteran-centered caucus called For Country. Despite all of the discord and rancor that you see on national cable news, we literally spend hours upon hours together in a skiff on trips abroad, including to Ukraine just before the war, and on the Armed Services Committee, where every year for the last 62 years we've passed a $800 and $900 billion defense authorization bill. We do get things done. They don't always make the news. To answer your question directly, as I know we're short on time, look, I have been incredibly frustrated with what I call President Biden, and Harris certainly endorsed, kind of too little, too late, trickle it in strategy. We seem to get to the answer about a year after the original request, and even when they get the weapon systems, their handcuffs placed on them. Christy and I were in Ukraine just before the war, and even then, when we were talking about how do we stop it, how do we deter it, how do we prevent this from happening, the answer from Washington to our embassy, from the administration is, well, we don't want to arm Ukraine too heavily. It'll be too provocative. It'll be too escalatory. It'll give Putin the excuse that he's looking for, when in fact I think that approach is actually what was provocative. And it is notable that Russia has invaded a neighbor under President Bush, under President Obama, and now under President Biden, and did not under the Trump administration, who did arm the Ukrainians first with the javelins. In terms of how do we drive this to some type of conclusion, I think first you're going to see a real enforcement of the sanctions, those mother of all sanctions that were promised. President Trump has been very clear that he thinks our greatest asset is the oil and gas that the United States is sitting on. Lifting the LNG ban pushing that clean American gas out into the world, driving down the global commodities market. And analysts have told me repeatedly, at least, that around $50 a barrel, both Russia and Iran, for that matter, their war machines dry up and they're on their back foot economically. So I think enforcing the sanctions, really having a tough discussion about European burden sharing, and driving both sides to a negotiation, I think we have to ask ourselves, and certainly my constituents ask me all the time, what does success look like? Is it in America's critical national interest to drive every Russian off every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea? How long will that take? To what end? What will that cost? And I don't think that's been well defined.
Congresswoman, how would you define it?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, and thank you again for having us. And we do agree more than we disagree on many of those things, but if it's okay, I'd like to back up a little bit on some of the conversation that Mike just unfolded. One is, I agree. I believe that the administration has been too slow in rolling out a lot of the aid and support, military specifically, for Ukraine. Full disclosure, my father was born in Lviv. That was Poland at the time. This is something that's kind of personal to me in terms of my understanding of global politics and the world order. So I would agree with you on that. That being said, I am very concerned about a future Trump administration because I'm not certain that there is a commitment to continuing to support Ukraine in their fight for their democracy and as a consequence for the fight for all of the democracies up and down kind of the Eastern European area, for NATO and what it means to the allyships that we have there, for the extended NATO, the extended allies that we have across the Indo-Pacific. I feel as though, although I would have liked to have seen the Biden administration be more aggressive with their support, and I would like to see them lift all of the different restrictions that they have, I really do think that the Biden administration and the future Harris administration understands the threat that it means to not be supportive of Ukraine. And I think that that's something that's a distinction between us.
Congresswoman, I want to stay with you on another important topic as it relates to the war in Ukraine, which is NATO burden sharing, encouraging the Europeans to contribute more to their own defense, to the collective defense of the alliance as well. Something I've heard from a lot of Democrats lately is that Donald Trump actually doesn't get enough credit for having pounded the table during his administration in pushing these European nations, particularly in Western Europe, to contribute more to their defense, to meet and exceed that 2% of GDP threshold. Do you see it that way? Does Trump deserve some credit for strengthening the NATO alliance in that respect? Because now you've got 2/3 of all NATO members meeting.
Sure, yeah, and let's back up a little bit. Nothing's more sobering than a war on your own continent to make you put up and play into the game and pay for the game. But you're not wrong. I do think there are several things that I think President Trump has good instincts on. One is the pacing threat of China. One is the importance of making sure that NATO participates, and they have. One thing that we don't have a lot of ability, speaking about the press, to try to articulate is, you're right, 2/3 of NATO countries are now participating at greater than 2%, and many of them have participated in terms of support for Ukraine at a much higher level as a percent of GDP or as a percent of dollars spent than we have. So, kind of this narrative that somehow we're still sharing the burden, I don't believe is true. And so I don't think that I necessarily attribute that to President Trump pounding the table as much as I attribute it to the fact that Ukraine was invaded. A sovereign nation was invaded on the continent of Europe.
Congressman Waltz, we have limited time here, so I want to pivot to China, which Congresswoman Houlahan just mentioned.
Should I just make one?
Yes, yeah, of course.
2% was the minimum that everybody pledged to a decade ago. You don't take the F student and pat him on the head for getting a D. Right? I mean, we should be celebrating those like Poland that are 4%, the Baltics that are truly investing, but the large economies, frankly, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, that should have been there a long time ago, getting to those points after whole cities have been devastated, after millions have died, isn't sufficient. And I don't think anyone should be taking a victory lap. If you look in contrast to Japan, who sees the threat coming. This is my pivot over to
Asia.
over to Asia, and understands what's going on in the Second Thomas Shoal and the South China Sea and what have you, and is making those investments as a deterrent measure, not a reactive measure. Japan should be celebrated for doing that, Poland and others as well, but we still have a long way to go, and I have real questions about how those contributions are being valued as well. There was recently a tranche of German tanks that were so bad, the Ukrainians, as desperate as they are, gave them back and said, this is going to cost us more to fix than to accept. How were those then valued? Were they valued as new, or the kind of the lemons that they were? So I think there's a lot to unpack there.
So within the last hour or so, we got some news from the Biden administration. They announced plans to ban Chinese software from U.S. cars, citing national security concerns. This sort of goes at the technology competition with China and efforts by Congress and the administration alike to try to enable that competition while also trying to deter a wider conflict with China. Congresswoman Houlahan, how do you view those two goals, and do you think that is it possible that they could be in conflict with each other?
So I'm intrigued by the banning of Chinese software. It just in some ways makes sense for lots of different reasons. We were talking behind the stage about kind of the implications for national security of if we're driving around in cars where we can be tracked, monitored, our cars can be stopped. Those kinds of things are really frightening when you think about the possibilities and the implications. I think this is another place where there's a lot of common ground, a lot of place where we agree that this is something that's worrisome and that the Chinese are not necessarily our friends. But I also would flip it back on all of us, which is there are many American companies as well that are sharing information with China, sharing software with China too, that is making us vulnerable, because all of this is a data play. Fundamentally, everything that we're talking about is the volumes and volumes of data that we're providing, either us to them to us, or open source. And we have a lot of thinking to do. And I'll end by saying, in Congress, there are fewer than 24 out of 435 members of Congress with STEM backgrounds, and I'm one of them. But we need more people in the body who think about these things with a technical brain and a technical mindset. And so I would encourage any of you all who are sitting there, out there in the audience, and who have a STEM background, to think about running for office in this way.
Congressman Waltz, I want to get your perspective as well, but also note for the audience that these two members of Congress sit on the House Intelligence Committee together, so they get the highest level classified briefings on all of this, and they generally get sort of a very thorough education on how this is all impacting our competition with China, as well as efforts by the administration to, again, prevent a wider conflict. But Congressman Waltz, I want to get your perspective too.
Well, I agree with Chrissy. This, data is the the oil of the industrial age, and this is a massive competition for data, the ability to use it, and our collective AI race. And I would just say the long pole in the tent, as we say in the Army, on AI isn't necessarily the talent or the algorithms or even the data and fully curated data. It's energy. And we will not win the AI race on wind and solar. You just can't do it. So I go back to kind of full circle on, we are blessed with clean, affordable gas sitting right underneath our feet. And one of my frustration, whether it's how we've dealt with Iran, how we dealt with Russian economy, how we've dealt with inflation here at home, or our investments into being able to power the AI race, is what I think has been a really, a frankly, not great energy policy on behalf of this administration. On China, everything that we're doing, if you have TikTok on your phone, if you're driving a car, software on our cranes is a massive data collection mechanism. And she is openly talking about winning the competition with not just the United States, but with the West, by outdoing us from a technological standpoint.
With the limited time we have remaining, I want to pivot a little bit to the presidential race, the contrasting visions, if you will, on foreign policy. Congresswoman Houlahan, there's been a lot talked about in terms of how Vice President Harris would be different from President Biden on foreign policy. Obviously, I think it's fair to say they have the same general worldview, but each person is different, though they would carry out the foreign policy of the United States in a different and distinct way. One of those ways could be, for example, when it comes to the war in Gaza and trying to push for a ceasefire, a hostage release deal as well. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because it is something that has divided some members of your party, and Vice President Harris has taken, in some ways, a different tone than President Biden has when it comes to addressing the conflict in Gaza.
Yeah, that I think is a fair and a good question. I think I mentioned that my father was born in Poland. He was born to a Jewish family, and he survived the Holocaust. And so, again, this is one of my motivating factors for being here in Congress. And I think that the war in Israel, the war in Gaza, fundamentally is a war about returning to peace and returning the hostages and making sure that they're, in my opinion, and I believe in the opinion of most of people on this stage, well, I don't know, two-state solution is something that I think is important. And I do think that Vice President Harris leads a little bit more aggressively on that issue than the Biden administration has. I look forward to peace in the Middle East. I believe it's possible. Right now, I really worry that the things that are going on up in the north with Hezbollah and with Lebanon are very, very destructive in terms of that possibility of going towards a peaceful solution. So I am very anxious about that evolution.
Congressman Waltz, I want to press you on something as well as it relates to your own party and this broader foreign policy ideological struggle, if you will. A few months ago, around the time of the NATO summit, I interviewed Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell in his office, who was, one of the things he was touting was the fact that more NATO members are now meeting the 2% threshold. Mm-hmm. But he also talked about this sort of, what's that?
Finally.
Yeah. He also talked about this, again, the ideological battle in the party on foreign policy between sort of the neoconservatives and those who align more with America First and Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Senator McConnell told me was that when he hears the phrase America First, it reminds him of the isolationists of the 20s and 30s, mm-hmm. who wanted to focus only on our own country, wanted to ignore what was happening in Europe, and of course we know what ended up happening in Europe, and the US didn't join the conflict until much later in it. What do you make of comments like that from Mitch McConnell? Albeit, yes, he's not a fan of Donald Trump, and yes, he is sort of a fixture of the Bush era neoconservatives. What do you make of a comment like that?
I think he and others are listening to a lot of loud voices that don't necessarily reflect the facts. I mean, if we actually walk through the facts, what did the Middle East look like under the Trump administration? ISIS, which was ravaging most of Iraq and Syria, attacks across Europe, inspired attacks in the United States, was largely defeated. Baghdadi was dead. Iran was broke. Its currency was tanking. Its oil exports dropped from 4 million barrels a day to less than 400,000. Its field general Soleimani also taken off the battlefield. And what did we have as a result? We had historic Nobel Peace Prize worthy deals being signed on the White House lawn in the Abraham Accords, not once, twice, but 3 times. If you look at, again, we didn't have an invasion in Eastern Europe on his watch. You had a significant generational pivot to China. But you do have, I think, a very different approach when it comes to our borders, securing our sovereignty. And I do think you would see much more of a focus on the Western Hemisphere, where we have all of the energy, food, critical mineral resources that we need if we, I think, invested in a more serious way in Central and South America. We want to talk about the root causes of migration. Let's put incentives in place to attract foreign investment into Central and South America in line with our values, not the Chinese Communist Party's values. So I just think that defies the facts.
Well, what's interesting is I think we agree on many, many things. And I think, frankly, that I agree in the need for investing more in the Global South. I think that I think we agree on the importance of making sure that we continue to support Ukraine. I think there's a combination of those. And I also think we agree largely on the energy issue. So I think we have a challenge, which is we need to make sure that we as members of Congress behave like grown-ups and figure out how to get along so that we can serve the American people.
But I put that also on my friends in the media. I put that on my friends in the media as well.
Well, on that note,
Great,
thank you
sir.
very much. Thank you very much for joining us. To our audience, thank you, Congressman Waltz and Congresswoman Houlahan. This was a great discussion. And again, thank you all for being here.
All right, thank you. Thanks,
You're welcome.
always.
Thank you.
Thank you.